I'm Bobby Dubois. I'm the Chief Science Officer of the National Pharmaceutical Council, and I want to welcome all of you, 200 plus of you are participants as we speak, to a fireside chat entitled, "It's Time to Talk COVID-19 Pricing." Now, like any good fire, it provides heat. And I don't have any doubt that we're going to have a little bit of heat today. And if any good fire, if you're not careful, there can be sparks. And knowing analysts as I do, I think we'll probably have a few of those too. But that's all good. At some point, I will move away from the proverbial fireplace and have a different backdrop. But for now, that's the plan. Well, a fireside chat isn't very good if it's just me. So we've got others in our fireside chat. I will be your humble moderator, or perhaps not so humble moderator, but I will be your moderator. And I'd like to introduce the panelists with us in the order in which we asked them to give a few minutes of opening statements. So we're going to do a few minutes from each one of the folks. Then I've got a number of questions queued up, and we're going to go through those. And we will then deal with Q&As from you guys. And we hope we can get to that quickly so that we can answer as many of your wonderful questions as possible. So after I finish, Sarah Iman will be the first up in terms of sharing a few minutes of her thoughts. And Sarah is the EVP and Chief Operating Officer at ICER, the Institute for Clinical and Economic Review. And I suspect most of you on the call know of her, know about ICER. They are an HTA evaluating mostly drugs, but some non-drug areas as well. So Sarah leads strategic planning and operations at ICER and is responsible for their public programs, communications, operations, and finances. She has 20 years experience in the business and policy of healthcare. And so that's a perspective that she will share. Next up will be Craig Garthwaite. Craig is the Herman Smith Professor and the Director of the Program on Healthcare at the Kellogg School of Management at Northwestern University in Chicago. He's an applied economist, and his research examines the business of healthcare with a particular focus on the interaction between private firms and public policies. He also studies questions of pricing and innovation in the biopharmaceutical sector, and he was named one of Poet and Quant's 40 best under 40 business school professors. Third up will be Peter Bach. Peter is the director of the Center for Health Policy and Outcomes at Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center in New York. He's a critical care doc, a pulmonologist, an epidemiologist, researcher, and healthcare policy expert whose work focuses on the cost and value of drugs. He's done a lot of work with respect to cancer drugs, but other drugs as well. He is leading efforts to increase understanding of the US drug development process and develop new models for drug pricing that includes value to patients. He was an author of an important article on pricing like Netflix, where Louisiana and now Washington are paying sort of a monthly fee, or in this case, a yearly fee or a multi-yearly fee for all the drugs that's appropriate for patients. And then finally, Peter Newman. Peter is the director in the Center for Evaluation of Value and Risk in Health. He's a professor of medicine at Tufts, and he focuses on comparative effectiveness and cost effectiveness in healthcare decision-making. He's the founder and director of the Cost Effectiveness Registry, a comprehensive database of cost effectiveness analysis in healthcare. He served as the co-chair of the second panel on cost effectiveness in health and medicine, and has previously been the president of ISPOR. So we have some wonderful panelists, and I know they will bring warmth, heat, and some sparks. So let me give you a few background thoughts before we turn it over to Sarah. So next slide, please. Well, many articles about the pandemic. This slide captures some that focus on the cost of taking care of folks, the healthcare expenditures, and then the Incidental Economist article about societal costs, the impact on GDP, the impact of being away from the work site, businesses going out of business, and the like. In the next slide, our esteemed panelists have been very active in this space. Sarah and ICER have put out an evaluation of remdesivir, the first available treatment that's been at least approved for emergency use, and they did an evaluation. I wrote an article framing some questions, many of which we'll try to get to today. Craig has written about being aware that low prices can have problems. So ICER has talked about high prices. Craig has talked about the impact on innovation if prices are too low. Peter Newman has reflected on what ICER has done and raised the question about societal benefits, productivity benefits, and the like. And then lastly, Dr. Peter Bock has written about vaccines and thinking a bit about pricing and how the government ought to purchase vaccines before they're ready. And actually some of that is sort of being done. So next slide, please. Well, it wasn't just these panelists that have been engaged. A lot of other groups have been engaged in the dialogue. You can see a number of these here. And in the next slide, the popular press has struggled also with the issue of pricing. Do we think about prices for remdesivir, vaccines, other treatments in the way we would any other drug for any other disease? Or is there something unique about a pandemic situation that we need to think about things different? Is it the normal way of looking, or is there a new normal? And when we're done, are we going to have yet another new normal? A lot of discussion around that, and we're going to continue that today. So in my final slide, I want to raise some of the point that we need to wrestle with. The first is when we think about value, we think about what the price of a therapy might be, what goes into that? Is it just cost offsets to the medical system? Should it be years of life saved and some quantification around that? Should it incorporate GDP impact, productivity impact, fear of contagion? You can't figure out a price if you can't figure out what determines the value of a drug. So that's the first topic we're going to address. The second really asks the question of, is the world different now? If we were willing to pay a certain amount per year of life or life saved, do we pay less now? Do we pay more now? Is that going to be a new normal when we're done? Third, we all want innovation, and we all want accessible innovation. So somehow we got to balance the cost to the patient, to the payer, to society, with the desire for continued innovation. As you can see, these are very easy questions. I'm sure we'll solve them all before we're done. And a terribly interesting question is, if there are a lot of benefits that a drug or vaccine brings, who gets those benefits? Does the manufacturer get all of them? Some of them? Does society get all of them because it's a pandemic and therefore there should be no profit involved? Does it matter whether the revenue is going to be $500 million, $1 billion? Does that matter? Do the benefits of $1 trillion improvement in GDP, does that change how much the manufacturer gets or everybody else? And then almost the most important question is the last one. How do we answer these questions? Who answers these questions? Do we have a plebiscite? Do we just put it out there and have a vote? Or do we say our elected representatives? Or do we create a commission that brings people together? I don't have answers to this one. I don't have answers to a lot of them, but I'm hoping we can begin to explore those. Now, just like the fact I don't actually have a fire in the back of my office, it's 107 degrees in Austin today, so probably not a good idea to have a fire. But we did want to bring a little fun to this, so a fire in the fireplace seemed like a little bit fun. How else are we going to have some fun? Most importantly, I want to engage you, the audience. So we are going to have a series of polls throughout the session. Now, not surprisingly, these polls are going to be a lot like the questions you see up here. Depending upon the sample of people who showed up, obviously the answer to the poll could be very different. It could be very pro-market, it could be very pro-government, and that doesn't say anything about my esteemed colleagues and how good of an argument they make. So we're going to do each poll twice. First, we're going to get your going-in assumption. As an example, when you think about value proposition and price, should it include productivity and other societal benefits? ICER has one approach, others on the call might have a different approach. What's your going-in belief? So we're going to ask you that. And it may be a majority in one area, maybe a majority in the other. I don't really care where it is. What I am caring deeply about is where are we at the end of a few minutes of dialogue. And so we're going to repeat the poll. So you got to stay engaged and hopefully poll twice. So you do it before and you do it after, and we can see if the needle moves. And those that spoke can feel really happy if it moved in their direction and not so happy if it kind of moved in the other person's direction. So we have 3 questions, 6 polls, and that's about as complicated as we need to get. So with that, let's share the fireplace, as it were, with my colleagues and turn first to Sarah.
Thank you. My thanks to NPC for organizing this and to my fellow panelists. I'm really looking forward to this conversation. I thought I'd start just by telling those who don't know a little bit about ICER and why we do what we do. We are an independent, nonpartisan nonprofit. We conduct health technology assessments on new interventions, new drugs, other non-drug topics in the healthcare system. And it's really meant to inform a conversation about price. We do exist because we know that patients often don't get access to the care they need because of cost. And when we have an objective analysis of how much better a new treatment is than what we're already doing, then we can anchor our conversation about price in evidence and data, and not what the government granted monopoly allows a manufacturer to charge. We really do need to have a different conversation about pricing in a pandemic. And so we've produced a white paper, we've done a preliminary analysis of remdesivir, the first treatment to get emergency use authorization from the FDA for COVID. And let me just spend a minute about why we think that's true. Everyone is concerned about getting back to normal. Whatever normal looks like, could be a new normal. We all are feeling the effects of the economic impact. What we have in front of us are choices that we can make as a society about the policies that we put forth that incentivize the innovation that we desperately need to get back to normal. When we don't have this public conversation and we don't have evidence and data anchoring that conversation, we're left with just the politics or the gut feeling. And sometimes that can lead to too much of an award for innovation. We don't want to overpay, because then we're leaving money on the table. We've got affordability issues already in the healthcare system. We're going to have affordability issues with the number of eligible population for a COVID vaccine or for a treatment. On the other hand, if we don't have an adequate sized prize, if you will, for innovating, then we're not going to get the treatments and the vaccines that we need in order to reopen the economy. And so the complexity of sort of that impact led us to do our initial analysis of COVID-19 for remdesivir for COVID-19. The model was really designed, again, to anchor the policy conversation. So we looked at 2 ends of the spectrum, if you will. We looked at a cost recovery model. How much would it cost, how much should Gilead charge to recover what it's invested in its research and development program? And also, how much could they charge if they were just looking to recover the cost of manufacture and distribution? We used several different pieces of information to anchor that. We got $10 to $600 if you're just recuperating or recovering the cost for manufacture and distribution, but as much as $1,000 to $1,600 if you are rewarding Gilead for the money that they've invested in the clinical trial program so far. So that's one end of the spectrum, cost recovery. The other end of the spectrum is what ICER is very well known for. We do assessments of the value of a new treatment, and that is anchored in scaling the price to the clinical benefit that patients receive. And so when you do that, and you can use different health maximization thresholds in order to scale what the price should be, you can get a price of about $4,500 to $5,000 for a course of treatment with remdesivir. Importantly, we conducted a scenario analysis with our most recent update, because we've seen the data on these steroids that's shown some effectiveness in reducing mortality and improving health. And while I'll acknowledge that's not peer reviewed, this is why it was just a scenario analysis. If we add dexamethasone to the standard course of treatment with remdesivir, it actually lowers the fair price for remdesivir because we have another drug in the mix that's helping improve outcomes. And in that case, we see a fair price more in the $2,500 to $2,800 range. ICER's not here to say what the fair price should be. We're here to produce information so that all of the policymakers in the system have some data and some evidence to inform just the debate that we're having today. We're going to get into the weeds, I bet, today on societal versus health. Bobby has teed up the questions really nicely. But I want to just end my opening remarks by highlighting the importance of acknowledging the uncertainty that we have when it comes to the data on remdesivir and likely the data that we're going to have on the other treatments and the vaccines that are in the pipeline. And we have to acknowledge that there is some concession that comes when we talk about what a fair price is if we have so much uncertainty about the benefit. And when we get into the conversation later today about who shares in the benefit, I would just put forth that when I spent nearly a decade in the pharmaceutical industry, I worked with pharmaceutical scientists who were motivated by answering really crazy scientific questions, curing human disease. And they weren't motivated by stock price. They weren't motivated by what price they could charge. And so let's keep that in mind as we have the conversation today. There is an incentive inherent in all of the scientists working in pharmaceutical companies right now, just because they want to be part of the solution to reopening this economy. And the argument that they deserve, their companies deserve all of the social surplus that's created by their intervention really deserves a robust conversation, which is, I know, what we're going to have today. So thank you, Bobby.
Sarah, thanks so much. Craig, I think you are next queued up for your thoughts.
Thank you very much for having me. Thanks everyone for joining for the panel today. I think when we talk about pricing COVID-19 treatments, there's sort of two ways you can break down the conversation. One is about the price of any particular treatment. So sort of Sarah walking us through the conversation about how should we price remdesivir, or what is the clinical trial evidence for remdesivir. The second is more how conceptually should we think about the idea of pricing in a pandemic. And so I wanted to tell Bobby, I'll take my 5 minutes to talk a little bit about how an economist would think about the way we want to think about just pricing it as a model. So innovation policy, as sort of probably everyone on the call is aware, is really just a trade-off. And it's a trade-off between access today and providing the incentives for innovation in the future. And so we allow some degree of market power for pharmaceutical companies today in order to allow them to recoup some of the investment of R&D and really to provide the incentive for the next firm to make the investment in new products. And to the degree that the amount of social benefit that comes from the new products outweighs the cost of reduced access today, we would say that that policy is welfare enhancing. And that really is the bedrock that underlies the idea of innovation policy as it's structured in the United States and in most developed countries. And so if you want to evaluate or think about that type of policy or that type of policy in a pandemic, it's important to think about what drives social welfare, right? What drives the willingness to pay for products. Over time, partly because of the work of ICER and other people, that conversation has largely collapsed down within the policy community to a question about the clinical value of the product. What is the medical value? And that's clearly, if not the dominant, certainly one of the most important features about how a product contributes to welfare or willingness to pay. It's certainly not the only way that a product generates social welfare. And so the pandemic and COVID-19 really helps us to understand these other sources of value as well. There are things like new innovations providing insurance value, which would just be the fact that if we had a cure, imagine a true cure for COVID-19, right? Some 5-pill sequence you took the minute you tested positive and you knew you weren't going to end up on a ventilator. That would really, in terms of the ease of mind of everyone in the insurance pool, change how they viewed every day when they wake up, where a lot of people do wake up meaningfully afraid of the fact that there's no way to gain insurance against the medical risks that they face from COVID-19. And a product, regardless of what you paid for it, would transfer that uninsurable medical risk into an insurable financial risk. And we have systems to deal with that. And that's real value that should be rewarded. In addition, given the contagious nature of this condition, right, we do have the fact that if we could have a cure or a vaccine or something that allowed us to all go back to work, huge societal value would be unlocked, right? I have a young 7- and 5-year-old. The idea of another quarter at home with them and homeschooling is terrifying on a number of dimensions. If that could go away, if I could send them to school and I could go back to work and I could teach all the students at Kellogg in person, there would be a lot of value that would get unlocked from that and from everyone else being go back to the office. And that's value that we want to reward. And why that matters, like why the price then becomes an issue, is we're only going to be willing to get what we're willing to pay for. And so if we send signals to the market to say that we don't care about these other sources of value, there will be less investment in innovation, right? So if we think about the term that Sarah used a lot on her part, which was the fair price, which does sound like a recommendation, I would note, if you're going to call something a fair price, that ignores all of these other sources of value, well, that means that we might underpay for innovation. And it's not so much about remdesivir. Right? If remdesivir was truly like the cure, right? And I think Peter probably will talk about how we don't have good evidence that it is. And I think we could use a lot more evidence in this place. But imagine that remdesivir truly was a cure for COVID-19. We could have a conversation about whether it's worth it to take that product for society and not give Gilead shareholders any reimbursement. But it's not the cure. We need other people to make investments to develop the next product, be it an antiviral or some ideas of the innate immune response that people are going to have, or eventually a vaccine. And while I agree with Sarah that lots of people in pharma are there for the altruism, they're there because they want to help society, and altruism is a feature of society that we can use to get people to try and develop new drugs, I think we would be doing a disservice to society if we put all of our eggs in the altruism basket. What I really want is I want every firm out there, and really every early stage venture capital firm that's giving the money that those scientists are using to develop their products, to think that the investment in a COVID-19 treatment is the right thing morally and the right thing financially. And that's going to get us to the point where we will get the kind of innovation that we need. And that's really, that's what drives a lot of how I think we want to think about this. I don't think we want to say that during a pandemic, for some reason, we don't care about those other sources of value, or they shouldn't be part of the price, or that the insurance pool shouldn't pay for those things. So thank you for having me, Bobby.
Wonderful. And next up, we have Peter Bock.
Yeah, hi, Bobby. Thanks for having me as well. I'll build on the comments from Sarah and Craig to some extent. About remdesivir specifically, as well as I'm sure a bunch of other topics that are about to come up about how you measure value. But I actually want to start in a slightly different place. Of course, as Craig has noted, we're talking about a set of trade-offs, rewarding innovation or transferring money to companies so that future companies invest in trying to develop new therapies that help us. And that's trading off against access and other uses of money, and today and of course tomorrow. And so that's what I actually want to focus on, because I think something interesting has happened, which is that we've gone, I think the very conceptualization of measuring the value of the therapy, no matter what dimensions you care to include, medical, only medical, and return to work or things like that, that's, the conversation is morphed into, well, that's how much we should pay for a treatment. I've never looked at that kind of value assessment that way. I've always looked at it as telling me how much we should not pay for a treatment, specifically a price above whatever that value calculation turns out to be. And the reason is baked into that, and I don't know what this number is, if it's 50,000 a quality or 150 a quality or whatever, baked into that in the current, in present day, is the notion that at this threshold, call it 150,000 per quality, we have reasonable, this is a reasonable use of money. At 151,000 per quality, now we're using the money for a treatment which is going to provide less benefit to society as a whole than some other use of the money. Now, I'm not saying that number is correct. I'm not saying all of this other calculus has been done. I'm not saying that that necessarily is the right trade-off in terms of incentives for future innovation, but I just think it's a curiosity that this idea, which is really an allocation exercise, which tells you kind of the threshold willingness to pay for this rather than some other thing, has turned into the amount we should pay. Because it isn't, and that's clear. Craig's 100% right. We want to incentivize innovation. And the magic number we're all looking for is exactly how many dollars we have to take from society to get innovation at the pace we want. And I think we probably all agree that at the extremes, you give nothing for a new drug, you won't get a lot. You give a lot for a new drug, you'll get more. The shape of that response curve is difficult to discern, but I think we all agree in general terms that more money might drive more innovation. So let me get to the other points. Craig, Sarah both referenced kind of altruism. Let me as something that's a separate incentive. Let me articulate it slightly differently. When we want to talk about spillovers or secondary benefits of having a treatment beyond making the sick person in front of you healthier, like return to work, I think it's also important to think about what they are on the company side. And it's not just altruism. We have signals from the market. So we can look at, in a business class, and people will say it's all about, returns to shareholders, but revealed preferences show something very different. Companies like Johnson & Johnson have said they're going to give this vaccine at zero profit, what I take to be some version of cost, if they're able to create a vaccine. Now, clearly they could charge more. So somewhere in the accounting is some value they're going to capture that's non-monetary. Now, maybe future value. They think they can charge more in the future by being good citizens. It may be better employee retention. It may be brand recognition or enhancement. But those things, that is a spillover back to the company in this national crisis we have to take into account. And I'll point out that Johnson & Johnson is still talking about taking Tylenol off the shelves, something they did, I think, the day I went to get my learner's permit. So this is a very old thing that they have continued to milk for their brand, which probably wasn't that consequential economically. It's clear that there's tremendous value there to them for things like this, if they have the COVID vaccine, if you will. The other thing I want to point out is let's be cautious about this side of binary formulation of innovation, not innovation. And on this point, I want to raise a question about remdesivir. I actually basically could care less how much that drug costs. I don't think it's of importance given the global economic ruin that this disease is causing. What troubles me is the company now has an internal, very strong incentive to preserve and grow the remdesivir franchise, which you can trace to them not doing the proper clinical studies of the treatment and resisting doing further evaluations that would help us as doctors actually use the drug better. And so they've resisted running their own placebo-controlled trial. They've resisted creating placebo for other people to run trials of their therapy because, if you will, they've made their shot from half court. They're not going to get up there and say, oh, let me try and do it again. They got a government-funded study to reject the null hypothesis on a surrogate marker, and they're done. And I think one of the reasons is if they go do another trial, that franchise could be sunk. And I'd frankly rather just write them, pay them at cost for the drug and write them some checks to do the right studies so we can optimally use this therapy and everyone that's going to come after it.
Peter, thank you. And last in our beginning part of things will be Peter Newman.
Well, thanks, Bobby. Thanks for bringing us all together. Great to be here. A lot of good points have been made. I don't want to repeat too much. Obviously, there's a lot of questions, no easy answers. Things are moving fast. Let me start by saying I think that ICER has played a positive and constructive role in this debate. I'm not saying that because Sarah's here, but I think it's true. One can disagree with their assumptions, and my colleagues and I have, but still believe that it's useful to have an independent agency trying to help us think about value and think about cost effectiveness. I even like the cost recovery and the value-based pricing, even as both have a lot of challenges. In a public health emergency, we might want to look at costs and reimburse based on some cost recovery model. I thought setting the R&D to 0 in the first phase of this estimate was ill-advised. They've updated that. Obviously, cost recovery models have problems. They send the wrong signals. They reimburse based on costs and give incentive to raise costs. The value-based price exercise I thought was very useful. It's a traditional cost per quality, which has its advantages. So, give ICER credit. They're doing something hard and fast-moving. Yes, and to Bobby, to your article, it would have been nice to have more stakeholder input. Be nice to have other estimates out there, but I give ICER credit. I also quibble with some of their assumptions, and I think it's important to look at some of them. The 50,000 per quality we'll come back to. It raises questions. It departs from their own precedents. Perhaps it's more suitable in a pandemic, but they didn't offer any real rationale for that. And I just point out, even at the 100,000 per quality, their fair price goes up to 30,000, something like that. Secondly, they didn't really do any analysis on health capacity. If you're reducing length of stay in the hospital, that could have huge benefits. It isn't an appendix as I read the reports in the update, but it's only in an appendix. And it shows fair price goes up quite a bit. And finally, and Craig touched on this, societal benefits. CBO estimates the pandemic's going to cost $8 trillion over 10 years, something like that. It's 70 billion a month. It's probably an underestimate. This is costing us trillions. And so, of course, as Craig says, if we have treatments and vaccines that get us back to work and to school and get the economy to recover, there's huge benefits. Now, ICER said it's inappropriate. The policymakers wouldn't want to see that. And, it just seems there's a missed opportunity there, that ICER really has a role now as a kind of quasi-national HTA body. I think it might have helped all of us to help us think about these societal benefits. It doesn't mean the drug gets that price, but I think, doing some analysis, doing some sensitivity analysis, showing what those benefits might be would have been useful. You mentioned, Bobby, I was the co-chair of the second panel on cost effectiveness. This panel recommends that a cost effectiveness analyses do a health perspective and a societal perspective. And the reason for the societal perspective is not to support higher drug prices. It's to try to really understand the value associated with different investments in health, whether they're public health strategies, they could be mitigation, suppression strategies for COVID, or whether they're procedures, devices, diagnostics, or drugs, that we need a standard, a basis for consistency and comparability. And knowing the societal value helps us improve the population health given our resource constraints. And again, we shouldn't conflate doing a societal perspective with jumping to that the drug company gets that price. There are lots of things that go in to the discussion about the fair price, and it may be very different in a pandemic, and we'll come back to that. And finally, there's some other questions we haven't really touched on here that I hope we come back to. One, we need to ensure that people have access to these drugs and vaccines, and that raises and equitable distribution. And I know Peter Bach has written about this. That gets to questions about insurance and payment. I hope we come back to those. There are certainly questions, and Peter Bach just raised them, about evidence generation and how we can ensure that evidence is generated, even when there may not be incentives to doing so. And finally, and many people have touched on this, we need to balance those things, or at least keep in mind all of those things while preserving incentives for innovation to have the products for the next pandemic. It's very hard to balance all those. I don't have the answers, but I think those are the right questions. Thanks.
Great questions, and we will wrestle with at least some of that and try to get to the answers of some of that. Well, I think we've reached the end of our professorial part of the session today, and more moving into the chat part. And we want to get your views, not your views as in the 4 people that just spoke, but your views as in the 300 people that are out there. So now it's time for our first poll. And again, we're going to do it twice, now and then after we have a little bit of a discussion around it. And we've heard Peter talk about this, and let's begin to explore this. So should a treatment's price reflect just the medical benefits it produces, which could be, you know, you don't go into the hospital, you're out of the hospital quicker, you don't die, there's a certain number of years of life. Should it be constrained to the health side of the equation, or should it also reflect the improvements in productivity or broader societal benefits? We heard fear of contagion, insurance risk, et cetera, et cetera. So now is your chance to answer the question. Should it be narrowly defined as to what is value and its price, or should it be more broad and encompassing of these other types of capabilities?
Bobby, is it possible to edit the question to include an alternative other than?
Too late. Can't do it. We're going to just do this way.
We
If you guys want to
covered these on email, I believe.
later, that's okay. And I purposely did not have a multiple option capability. You gotta throw your dart. All right, everybody. Now, I don't know when we've reached a sufficient number that we can publish results here. So, Maria, you're going to have to decide when you think we've gotten the bulk of people who are about to answer, and then you can share that with us.
People are still voting. So.
People are still voting.
Yes.
Hard question.
Well, they're stymied because they were given such a limited set of options.
Exactly. It's my fault, Peter. I agree.
The Chicago people are voting twice, though, so it's going to take us a little longer.
That's important.
That's right. The people in the district are trying to vote, but they're not allowed to.
Okay, Maria, why don't we call it a day? Okay, it looks like 3-1 or so. Think it should be broader. So not a surprise, I'm gonna turn to you, Sarah. In the cost effectiveness analysis that ICER did on remdesivir, they chose not to include these broader set of benefits. Why is that?
To be very clear, it was a choice on this analysis, right? So we've put out the adaptations that we'll use to our typical value assessment approach for potential treatments and vaccines in a pandemic, and we clearly state that we will consider a modified societal approach or perspective on a case-by-case basis. I think it's important to talk about data when we're talking about the societal impact. My understanding of the data that we have from Gilead on remdesivir is that we don't have any data on the societal impact. I heard someone mention earlier about, I think it was you, Peter Newman, about the potential reduction in length of stay and what that does to health capacity. My understanding also from the remdesivir data is it actually didn't reduce the length of stay, just the time to recovery, which is different. And so in the absence of data about how remdesivir in particular impacted all of these very important other societal benefits, we thought it was inappropriate to do a societal perspective at this time. If those data are produced, if we have more information, I think that's something we would absolutely consider as we continue to update and evolve this model, both based on new data and feedback. The other thing I want to emphasize is that societal perspective isn't all upside, and we talk about that a lot. And Peter Newman, I really appreciate how you're talking about the societal perspective to inform a conversation, not necessarily to talk about that should be captured in a price. But we get into really tricky territory when we start taking the societal perspective in terms of both upside and downside. And again, not measured very well, in particular for this drug. So we thought it was inappropriate to do the societal perspective at this time.
So Peter Newman, I'm going to turn back to you. The second panel makes it very clear that having two analyses side by side is illustrative and important. Sarah raises a good point. We have no data. Now, if this was a migraine drug and they had multiple years of development and they came to market and didn't show any studies that looked at productivity. Well, that's a reasonable argument to say you can't get credit for something you didn't measure. But every model has assumptions, and you're projecting things. And in a pandemic situation, obviously we can't wait and see how this all unfolds and do a counterfactual against it. Given the lack of evidence that Sarah cites, is it appropriate or inappropriate to try to have that parallel analysis with the other elements considered?
Yeah, well, listen, I certainly understand that ICER's in a tight spot and its assumptions will get a lot of attention. And so, you know, it has to be careful about what it does. However, the fact that there's limited data means, yeah, don't put it in the base case, but help us understand in sensitivity analyses what the impacts might be. By the way, ICER, and I think appropriately, shows us an analysis where they don't give the mortality benefit to remdesivir. I think that was the right thing to do in a sensitivity analysis. It didn't hit its, you know, statistical significance. It was very close. So by all means, show that. It shows that the value-based price goes down to $390. I think that's great, but do it on the other side too. And, you know, those of us who do these kinds of models say uncertainty is sort of a finding. You know, it's not a sort of something you just throw out and say there's nothing we can do. We should be informing decision makers and showing if the drug improves time to recovery and seems to reduce mortality, yes, do some sensitivity analysis and help us understand what the impacts might be.
All right,
Bobby,
we're going to keep this punch. Later, we are going to bring everybody together on this. Okay. I know that this seems constrained, but we've got a lot of critical topics. We will come back in the open session. Craig, just jot down your points you wanted to make, Peter as well, because we could easily spend 90 minutes on this topic. So, quick poll. Did Sarah or Peter change anything? Let's see. You know the question. Choose your answer. Maria, we're not going to give them too much time because next we'll be on to the next question. All right, Maria, let's close it. Show us our results. Well, I'm not taking out my magnifying glass. Looks pretty darn similar to what we saw originally. Okay, let's move on. Now, Sarah mentioned, and others touched on this issue of the threshold. ICER, in its remdesivir approach, chose a $50,000 cost per quality threshold. New poll. When you think about a pandemic and the value that a drug or vaccine brings, should the threshold be different or not? Can we get the next poll, please? So, normally, ICER and others have considered $100,000 to $100,000, $150,000 per quality. In a pandemic, all sorts of things are different. Lots of people may need it. Does that change the threshold? Should you use the same threshold? Should you use a higher threshold considering all the other benefits to bringing society back together and working in GDP? Should it justify a higher price? So we should have a higher threshold. And that, of course, affects affordability. Or ICER chose a lower threshold because they felt the pandemic was a very different situation and altruism and other kinds of things. So should our threshold be our usual, whatever usual is, you know, you may think it should be 75,000, you may think it should be 30,000, but should it be usual? Should it be higher than usual or lower than usual? Let's go ahead and give us your answers. And in our response to this, we're going to have Peter Bock first and Craig. Well, again, without a magnifying glass, I say it's a third, a third, third. A third basically say the same, a third higher, third lower. Well, this ought to be an interesting discussion. Peter, where should the threshold be? And then Craig, a response to that.
Yeah, I mean, I don't love it as a generic or general question. Again, the threshold, as I pointed out at the top, is about the price we should pay relative to other uses of money. And it's not the amount that should be transferred to the company. Those are very different conceptually. I think of the value-based price, if you will, as one of the ceilings, and the other ceiling being the amount we need to transfer to get the innovation we want. So we've been talking about remdesivir. It makes very little sense to pay the kind of price we're paying for the reasons I've mentioned. Particularly as first buyer in the world, to pay more than any other country doesn't make a lot of sense. But again, more critical than the threshold is the question of the incentives for the company to properly evaluate the therapy so we can use it optimally. That said, I would like to see an analysis of how much health we could gain by investing in some other stuff that is clearly failing around us, adequate testing that's timely, tracing of contacts, public service education around basic stuff like masking, adequate personal protective equipment. It's difficult for me to estimate off the top of my head, but I would suspect that a handful of N95 masks would produce more health in the healthcare setting than a course of remdesivir, would be my guess. Just preventing a few infections, but maybe you have to prevent 100 or something like that. You could still easily do that with masking and proper PPE. I'm not going to do that analysis now, but that gets to this issue of this isn't a cure, this isn't going to prevent transmission. So where are we better off spending our money today and setting the threshold there? And given the paucity of other basic elements of what we need for this pandemic today for this drug, it suggests to me, if there were a formal analysis, it would generally lead us to, we should be using that money for other things like PPE, testing, public service, and education.
Craig, your thoughts?
Yeah, so Peter makes a number of points there. They seem to be in a world of far more constraints than I think we actually face on money here. If we look to the numbers that Peter Norman was talking about, of how much money we are losing on a daily basis, we have more than enough money to pay an appropriate amount for a drug and to pay for N95 masks for people. And so I think there was a nice column that Zach Cooper and others had, I think Steve Barry had in Political, that said we should be doing all of this stuff, right? You shouldn't be thinking about these as competing things for resources. When it comes to the actual threshold, I find it very strange. We can argue about in the first poll whether or not medical risk, the other benefits of society should be in the price or not. But if you start saying that in a pandemic, and particularly a contagious pandemic, we are going to deliberately reduce the threshold we normally use, we're sort of saying that not only do we think we shouldn't account for those, but we should go a step further and actually not give credit to these types of products, which could provide lots of benefits to society. I think that's just the wrong way to think about this. It's something that comes from, I think, a fundamental misunderstanding. Sounds harsh than I mean it to be, but there's been a number of statements on the call or on the webinar so far that prices are an allocative mechanism, or prices are about transferring resources. That's not all they are. Prices are a signal to future market participants. In fact, if we think about the way the market works, perhaps one of the most important things prices do is they send signals to the market in the future. And so if we think about this purely as there's a certain amount of pie and we want to cut that up using prices as allocation, I could understand why people might get to certain outcomes as to what they think. But if you think about prices as a signal, and that signal reflects value, then you start to understand as to why people might be concerned about underpaying for this, right? It is true that maybe the remdesivir price is high. Peter says that the first, largest buyer in the market doesn't normally pay a high price. It's not actually, that's not how I tend to think about markets. The first buyer is generally the one with the highest willingness to pay. And so they do pay the highest price, and it reflects some value that the product does create for society. But more importantly, it says, hey, to you, to Moderna, to, you know, a TIA that's developing a potential antiviral and oral statement, if you create value, we will reward you for it. And that's why I think we need to concentrate very carefully on this question.
Bobby, can I just,
yeah,
one sentence on this? An alternative explanation for this lower dollar threshold is all of the other benefits that accrue to the company for creating important treatments in this pandemic. So they might get, in terms of dollars, a lower dollars per quality, like 50 per quality or something like that. But they get all these other benefits, which are the very incentives that Craig is talking about that will make them pursue important treatments. And they'll get it in ways that aren't dollars.
For most of the companies, they don't care much about that. You talk about Johnson & Johnson, but Johnson & Johnson's a very peculiar company in that they have a very strong consumer branded presence as well, which is not true for other products, right? So Johnson & Johnson is selling you Tylenol, they're selling you Band-Aids. That's why they're telling you the story about pulling Tylenol off the shelves and maybe not talking as much about Tylenol in recent years, getting pulled off the shelves for other reasons. But so I think that we want to be very careful about saying there are all these benefits. There might be benefits to the entire pharmaceutical industry, but in a model of collective action, which is when we have multiple players in the market that we have, you shouldn't expect that any one firm is going to make the decision that benefits the entire industry. There's just no economic model that would support that type of behavior.
It's so curious
Okay.
that they're all constantly on television talking about their programs then and doing this media time.
Oh, they're talking about it. I mean, if you're going to do it, the first thing you might learn about in a business class about, you know, social good is that if there's things you're going to do anyway, you might as well talk about it. So they're going to talk about developing this. But I would look at the share price and suggest that I don't think the market thinks for Moderna that this is not going to be a commercial event.
All right, guys, wonderful. Let's go to our polling, see where we are, and move on to our next topic. And we will come back to these. Okay, threshold the same as usual, higher than normal, lower than normal. Will anything differ? All right, Maria, let's see where we are. I would say there was some shift to using the same threshold. And it looks like those numbers came from both the higher group and the lower group, as best as I can gather. Very interesting. Okay, given how time is flying, my team, let's skip. We were going to do a different question, but now I'd like to go to the third and final poll, and we're going to go to that related question. So we've heard a lot about benefit and this question of, should that benefit go to society? Should that benefit go to the manufacturer? How should we begin to think about that? And so we're about to explore that with our panelists. So how much of the benefit should go to the manufacturer? A small portion in a pandemic, about 50-50 split in a pandemic, or most of it, since they're doing a lot of heavy lifting, although the government may be paying for some of that. What do you guys think? And the answer is, okay, 50-50 split and an equal split on small and most. 50-50 gets 50 and small, most gets a quarter. Okay, let's have at it. Sarah, you're going to go first, then Peter, and then Craig, we're going to ask you to chime in here too.
Answering the question from the poll.
Well, or just the general topic. So when you thought about a proper price and you thought about the value it could bring, you could argue that you were giving all of it to the manufacturer. because you were saying the cost effectiveness is defined in a certain way and their price could be justified. Of course, you left out the societal benefits, so that would, of course, potentially increase it. How do you see the split?
One of the things that we try to do with the range of analyses, especially that we're producing on COVID-19, is really not to pick a winner. So you could argue the fact that we did a cost recovery model to help inform the conversation where very little of the social surplus returns to the manufacturer. It's just a commodity, it's just a good. And then producing information on the other end, where we did have the numbers in the report for 100, 150 per quality as well, to help inform the conversation, that we are saying that at least all of the clinical benefit produced that we know so far from the data accrues back to the manufacturer. So I wouldn't say that we have a horse in this race, if you will, except to be one of the agents for facilitating that conversation. I can share that in the public meetings that we've had on non-COVID topics, this comes up a lot. Whether it's a patient or patient advocacy group talking about how the money they raised 10 years previously at fundraising walks helped spur a research program at a company, and then how does that impact how much the company gets to sort of recoup from creating that medicine and charging money for that medicine when there was a societal push to get into that field, all the way to the other end, when we have companies that have invested in areas where there hasn't been a lot of interest or motivation, and it really did come from different incentives, as Craig has been talking about, are so important to incentivize the innovation. So I wouldn't say that we have a horse in this race in terms of deciding which of those, which part of the surplus goes back, as much as I think it's really important to talk about whether or not all of it goes to the company, and to produce this information, to have this conversation so we can debate if we think more of it deserves to go back to the company.
Wonderful. Peter, Bock, I know you and I have been on stage together, and you like your example of appendectomies, which saves 70 years of life for a kiddo, and rarely does a general surgeon get to charge $70 million, or $7 million, sorry. Does that help us in thinking about this? How would you split the pie?
Yeah, I don't remember that example, but no, that doesn't help me in thinking about it. These are very different markets. Surgeons are paid in just a fundamentally different way. And, they do pretty well. Doctors, if you rank the best paying professions in the country, 7 of the top 10 are in medical. So I think I'm not worried about surgeons getting back value for what they create. But no, this is an entirely artificial market for drugs at some level. The monopolies that are granted are there for a reason. It allows the companies to charge very high prices for a period to get their reward for having successful innovation. It's a very different model. And so I think we're really talking here about how to set those levels, as Craig suggested, to not signal to the company that's already kind of done the deeds for us, but to signal to the next company that it's worth making a run at it, because it's difficult and risky, and probability of success is well south of 100%. So I don't think that's, the surgeon doesn't help me. I do love that most people think most of the value should be transferred to the companies, however, and it makes me think that the next time I go to Shake Shack, I love those Smoke Shack burgers. I should be probably paying about $45 because that's probably the value of that burger to me. But I don't have to, because, we still have markets. And the reason I buy that burger is because it's worth more to me than they charge me for it. And so this idea, again, of value transfer is just not a useful construct for thinking about incentives for innovation. I also want to come back to this. I'm not going to let Craig have their last word lecturing me about Johnson & Johnson being a consumer company and therefore behaving differently. A little history is helpful here. Pfizer gave away diflucan in Africa. I think you'd agree that's actually a pharmaceutical company. Merck, you probably agree, is a pharmaceutical company. They gave away Mectizan to eliminate river blindness. These companies have done lots of things that cost them money, which enhances their brands even when they're not consumer products. And likewise, J&J, a company they says should be protecting its brand, you know, probably the worst possible misbehavior with Risperdal, with EPO, and some of their other kind of devices that, you know, caused many, many people harm, and their consumer products as well. So I don't think you can artificially bifurcate it post hoc and say their decision to charge cost for their vaccine is somehow bespoke to them. But I just, you know, the most important thing is innovation as a binary idea, like this thing's an innovation, the other thing isn't, really strips away some important nuance in terms of what we want in terms of treatments being tested and specified and understood. And if we give the prize for just getting, you know, an authorization in this case, or just for the FDA approval, we've actually set up a very problematic incentive when what we really want to do is fully understand this armamentarium, fully study it, because that is how we will kind of tackle these problems in front of us. And this mindset, like the mindset about p-values having cutoffs, which is not really how statistics work either, you know, has led us to this place where our science is less good because the way you earn your prizes is by meeting a low scientific bar.
Thank you, Peter. Peter Newman, you raised earlier that having the full benefit defined by including societal elements doesn't mean that becomes the price. So this, I think, directly relates to that, which is how do you decide how to split that pie between the manufacturer and society? Are there any things that can guide us?
Now, one way to, I was going to say, and I guess I still will say, is I don't love the question. I'm channeling Peter Bach here. I don't love the question because I think in a way it's the wrong question, or at least it's not the question we should put at the top of the list. The question we should be asking is, do we have the right laws and regulations and incentives to stimulate innovation? And do we have the right, you know, health system to ensure that people have access to useful new products that they need? I mean, whether or not the value capture is small, large, or medium, in a sense, is secondary. If we think we've set up the right system with the right structure to create the right incentives, okay, then we shouldn't worry as much about whether the capture is small, medium, or large. Now, having said that, I do think it's useful to do some calculations to try to understand what portion of the capture goes back to, or the value goes back to the company. And you've seen these calculations that show for products that go generic and are used in perpetuity, antiretrovirals for HIV, or I don't know, any number of statins and antihypertensive medications and on, you know, the companies received benefit during the time the brands were being sold, and eventually society gets a lot of the benefit. And I think those studies are useful to do, and it varies by product, to be sure. And there's lots of nuance I'm sure we could talk about. But I think it at least maybe reassures us that the systems we have in place are not, you know, totally out of whack. So, and, you know, finally you asked what, you know, what portion should go to the company. I don't know. Again, I think we should have the right systems in place. And that's the more important question.
Greg, the final word on this topic.
I think we'll see some commonality in terms of picking on Bobby and saying I don't love the question. So, and I apologize because it's hard to come up with good questions. I understand. But it is, I mean, this is a question of incentives. It's not a question about how much value should be transferred. I would know that even when you set the price at the average, you do have people like Peter who really like something like a Shake Shack burger, so he gets lots of consumer surplus. And then there's the person at the margin who doesn't get as much, and that's true for sort of evaluating life as well. And so it is about incentives. I didn't intend to lecture Peter about Johnson & Johnson, but I just found an interesting example. I also know that a lot of the other examples that are given when you see altruism by these companies, it's often altruism that is relatively low cost. What I mean by that is the opportunity cost of giving away diflucan in South Africa is very low because there was no commercial market there. They did not give it away worldwide, right? Just like giving the vaccine away worldwide would be an exceptional opportunity cost for shareholders. And while that could happen, it might be that the shareholders of Johnson & Johnson or Moderna or some other company suggest that they need to get none of the value and they're still going to plow ahead with this risky and uncertain investment. I guess that I take the mindset that I don't want to count on that. I don't want to put all my eggs in that altruism basket. And if I had to pick a place where I want to be wrong here, because really we're talking about, it's uncertain, right? We might underpay, we might overpay. I think Sarah and Peter both acknowledge that. If you had to ask me, where do I want to put the thumb on the scale, given the scope of the pandemic, I'm going to put the thumb on the scale in the favor of more innovation. Because I really think that we're facing an economic decline if this continues on, that will, make our, depending on who you are on the call, your grandparents or great grandparents, memories of the Depression look quite quaint.
So let's dive into this issue a bit more. And now this is the unscripted part, so everybody can have that. Everybody wants innovation. Everybody seems to think there is a price that's too high, so we need to find the balance point. Okay, and all you guys sort of avoided the question and wouldn't tell us what the balance point was. But underlying the balance point, I think there is a belief system. So let me ask the belief system. There are those that argue that big pharma makes too much money, and we could chop it in half and it wouldn't make a difference. They'll still innovate, they'll still have the same altruistic incentives. There are others who argue, well, wait a second, it's a direct dose response. The more profit opportunity, the more you're going to put into R&D. So yes, you don't know the right equation, but there is a belief system here that some would argue taking a profit away won't make any difference in innovation. And others would argue for every dollar taken away, it's likely to have some percent impact. So I'd like you guys to address that question, because I think that's really the underlying concern about too much or too little. Peter, Bach, you want to go at this first, and then maybe you, Sarah, next?
Sure, and I thought I did answer it actually. In this context for COVID, I think Craig and I agree, and I think we all agree on one basic fact, which is this is a generational economic event measured in trillions, not billions. And I honestly couldn't care much how much remdesivir costs. I think I've said that several times. What troubles me is the vehicle is blunting the proper research being done. But I don't think it's as simple as, companies make too much money or something nutty like that. The question is, what I'd like people to take from at least what I've said is that if you think about this as a simple function, as you add money, you get more innovation. I want to add another dimension here, which is, the nuance or the granularity or the details of that innovation. It's not just more new drugs, if you will. It's understanding them better. It's having them tested appropriately. I wrote a piece yesterday about we should be doing a randomized trial with Dex as a backbone with remdesivir, yes or no, remdesivir or placebo now for mortality. And that trial won't get done, but that's where the money should be going. And that's where if the only way we have to do this is to incentivize the private industry to do it as opposed to the government doing it or something like that, then those incentives should align not just with, hey, I have a drug, it's authorized, now I can sell it. Instead with, hey, I'm going to get a bigger prize or grant or non-dilutive financing, whatever it is, to really get the most we can out of these things. And it's one of the reasons value-based pricing has appeal, which is at least it somehow calibrates the reward with the size of the benefit. Because right now, as you look at pricing, net pricing or list pricing, those two things are poorly correlated no matter how you measure value.
Sarah, your thoughts on this issue?
One of the things that I really like about the value-based cost effectiveness approach is it's agnostic as to the profit that the company is going to get at the other end. So that's not part of the equation. The incentive to innovate is to make a better drug, make it have fewer side effects. Transformational clinical benefit translates into a very high price. We don't judge whether that price is going to a huge multinational company like J&J or to a small biotech like Alnylam, right? So we're agnostic. If they develop a drug, they're able to demonstrate the clinical benefit, cost effectiveness helps you go, there's the ceiling price for what we think is fair. We produce the cost recovery model, because we heard from so many policymakers running up through this pandemic, even before, that really do worry about and think about the profit and then whether or not the profit is fair. It's there for policymakers to consider, but there's a reason that cost effectiveness has been the backbone of the value assessment framework that ICER has done for over a decade. It's because it's agnostic as to the profit that comes later. It incentivizes making a really good drug because then you can charge a higher price.
Craig, what's your thoughts on this issue about profit and innovation?
So the research is clear in the economics that the greater the market return, the more investments you get in R&D. And so if you want to count investments in R&D as innovation, then it's clear there's that dose response relationship. I've been involved in teams that have been looking at this question because I think, that's not particularly satisfying. Just counting the number of clinical trials doesn't get you what we really care about. So even when I started, I said that innovation policy is this trade-off of the welfare benefits of new products compared to the lost welfare from reduced access today. And what we found in our work, looking, for example, at Medicare Part D, is that you do have some room on the margin, right, and to reduce the return on pharma and not really affect truly novel innovation. Truly novel innovation, to Sarah's point, is so valuable that, at the margin, we can, do some stuff with exclusivity periods. We can introduce some actual competition into Part D for drugs in the catastrophic region. Like, there's things we can do that will reduce the return that won't affect truly novel research. However, we don't know much about something like going to a cost of recovery model and like what that would do to the investment. At a minimum, that's cost recovery that's not sort of risk adjusted fully about how people allocate their capital. But we don't know what a really large change to the return would do to the incentives to invest in innovation. We do have some from theory. I know there's different views of theory on this panel, but from theory, we know that venture capital makes bets on drugs for large payoffs, and they're making option value bets, and the value of an option value strategy is growing in the variance. And what I mean by that is, like, you need to have a chance for a really high payoff. You make a bunch of bets for a little bit of money with the hope of a really high payoff. So if you trim off the really high payoff, you can really destroy that early stage investing. And so that's why I think there's a lot of concern about large changes to the returns. But we have room, and I've suggested a number of small at the margin changes that would reduce returns, and particularly in targeted ways. I know Peter and Norman want us to talk about how patients pay, and particularly if we did things that made drugs more accessible to patients but cost a little bit on the profit side. That's something that could have pretty good benefits without affecting truly novel innovation.
Peter Newman, you got the final word on this.
Yeah, so I'm sure we all have our belief systems, and in some sense, I suppose it goes to what we think about appropriate role of government and how we want to distribute resources and how we want markets to work and things like that. But I would think there might be some, consensus that at least there are some trade-offs here. Then, Craig just talked about it. If you lower prices, you lower returns, you're probably going to have less innovation. And the question is, how much less innovation are we willing to tolerate at some level, I suppose. But there is evidence that prices don't reflect value very well. And to get to Sarah's point, I think that's, the power of a cost effectiveness analysis is to help us think about the value and the value-based price. And, to get back to something Peter Bach said earlier, the other real power of the cost effectiveness analysis is it helps us think about that not only for drugs, but for alternative investments, so we should be doing these kinds of studies, and I would hope ICER could help us do them too, on mitigation and suppression strategies and N95 masks, all kinds of things that we should be doing.
Peter, thank you. And that actually relates to one of the questions that had come in about doing these analyses, not just on drugs, but on other things. One of the questions that also came in was, the government's putting money into all this. How does that affect a fair price, both for treatments as well as vaccines? Open jump ball here.
Just one observation, and we haven't talked about it, but I think there's a concern that somebody, the drug company, Gilead, whomever will profiteer or somehow price gouge in a pandemic. I mean, I think that's a very strong ethical concern that, but, and, you know, I think when Gilead went to set their price, they had to balance the court of public opinion in a sense against, you know, shareholder concerns and other factors. But we don't really talk about that when we price other products, PPE or whatever the other products that are being used, tests for COVID. And I think, you know, those are fair questions for all of the actors in the system, not just the drug company.
Anyone else in this question? The government putting money in.
This question comes up a lot, I think, in general about the role of the NIH in drug development. And whether and it gets down a little bit, I think, the question whether you think the NIH is a substitute or a complement for the work done by a drug company. And if you think it's a complement, you think that you want every company to use NIH research, maybe you don't want to put any restriction on prices. If you think the government's really, you know, bringing drugs to market, you might think that it's unfair. I think at a minimum, what we should probably agree on, and I think that's important as we think about, you know, the fact that, you know, Gilead's clinical trial was funded in part by the government, is that any restriction you want to put on prices, you probably want to put before you choose to partner with the company. So I'm particularly loath for the idea that we are going to have, you know, private companies make money to try and commercialize or develop NIH research, and then ex post someone comes in, oh, by the way, we're going to reduce the price that you have. I don't think that creates a lot of trust in the system. And so if we want to have a conversation about whether we think that any product that touches the NIH therefore should have a, you know, reduced price in the future, we should have that before the pharmaceutical companies are making their investments.
I agree with that.
Go ahead, Peter.
No, I agree with that completely. It's the steadiness and reliability of the signal to the market that's really, really important. And when we propose, you know, bigger ideas like price regulating biologics instead of using biosimilars, you know, we proposed paying the biosimilar companies because that would have come completely out of left field for them, and that's not right. That doesn't create stability. But I think of it as essentially a math problem. So Craig referred to it as essentially getting an option, but you can think of it as, you know, the companies, the calculus is the formula is simple. The companies take their own money and they develop drugs and they pay to test them. Then they get on the market if they're successful and they take our money as a reward, and that lasts for a period of time. Then there's generics or whatever, right? So that's the formula. So to the extent that, and I'm not saying this math is easy, but in principle, to the extent that instead of the company using its own money, it takes other money that's free, you know, it's not dilutive. They don't have to give up their equity or borrow the money or something like that. Or if they borrow it even on more favorable terms than the market would normally allow, those are subsidies. And if I get somebody to chip in, I mean, maybe my parents will chip in for half the option and let me keep the upside, but in every other market, it doesn't work that way. So if kind of the taxpayer gets in there and says, hey, I'll help you buy this option, then definitionally, the reward to the option holder should be less. Some of it should come back to the taxpayer. Now, we're not doing that. The government has committed essentially for a remdesivir sale at this point. They're spraying the federal dollar cannon all over vaccine developers. I don't know if there's any, I think most of those are other technology agreements, so there is no pricing constraint. But that is the basic principle of how drug development works. And if we taxpayers pay for all of it, for example, then there should be no return to investors who didn't put any money at risk in the first place at the extreme.
An extreme that we should know doesn't really exist, that the government pays for everything.
It's a gradient, right? So say the government picks up half, then I think the return should just be half-ish cut.
But no, that's not how incentives, if you want to go back to your statement that you care about how incentives work, that what we need to think about is what, if we do early stage research that can never become a drug unless a commercial entity takes it up. But I understand, but then we want to think about how do we get people to use that research? That's sort of our goal. That's the complement model. That's in general, that's why I tried to split up the pandemic versus in general, that's what the NIH does, right? Now, over time, the NIH has done more and more late stage research. I think that brings up a greater question as to one, why they need to do it. What is it about the market that's not allowing that to happen? And for sickle cell, we have some ideas, but for other gene therapies, it's not clear as to why they need to do it versus a private company, but why they need to do it. And given that they're doing it, how does that affect the right pricing system? But if it's early stage, we want them to think about the incentive to take up that research. I do think the remdesivir clinical trial is harder to think about in that setting.
Okay, we've got 8 minutes, 4 people. Everybody gets 2 minutes to finish. I would like, as part of your 2 minutes, we've raised a lot of tough questions here. What goes into the value price issue? Does our willingness to pay differ during times like this? What are the proper ways of providing incentives and the profit relationships? So my parting question for you guys is, we've talked about this, but how should we as Americans come to answers on these? We can pontificate, we can blabber, but how do we decide some of these, or who should decide some of these? So I'd love to have you guys address that as part of your final comments. And we'll go through the same order that we started. So Sarah, you're first, Peter Bach second, Craig third, and then Peter Newman.
Way to end on a really hard question, Bobby. I mean, I think that for me, when faced with a thorny question like that, I look to policy as a representation of sort of social will, and that there's lots of limitations to doing that. But we have made choices as a society with the policies that we've had. The Orphan Drug Act, we were expressing a policy preference, a societal preference to incentivize innovation for rare diseases. And we have examples that we can look to there. At the end of the day, for better or worse, the ultimate payers of the technology are going to be driving a lot of these choices. So whether that's Medicare, Medicaid, commercial payers, taxpayers, the ones who ultimately have to write the check for the new innovation are going to be expressing their preferences for how we continue to have these conversations and what's in and what's out. The shameless plug is that these conversations used to happen behind closed doors with no patients anywhere, with no input from the public, as payers were negotiating with individual companies about price and access. And that the core part of our mission is to elevate that national conversation, to make sure patients are at the center of the conversation, as they are at all of our meetings. The only other thing I would add in sort of closing, and we touched on it briefly, and I appreciated it came through in a lot of the Q&A from the audience, is equitable distribution and affordability really need to be part of the conversation when we're talking about COVID treatments. So I don't want to lose sight of the nerdiness of the conversation that we're all having and how we can pontificate about societal benefit versus thresholds. Not losing sight, at the end of the day, we need to make sure that everyone who wants and needs access to these therapies can get it in a way that doesn't bankrupt the health system.
Sarah, thank you. Keeping to our 2 minutes, hopefully. Peter Bach.
Sure. So, I think one of the constraints we've had in this conversation to some extent, and I've mentioned it, is this per unit payment or per prescription payment model. There's a lot of ways you can imagine delivering rewards to companies for successful innovation that would be more efficient. Netflix or subscription has come up, obviously. I think there's ways to think about alternative ways to finance the risk portion of drug development as well. And this conversation Craig and I just had about late stage, right before approval, government money coming in and how to think about that as well. You put up an article early, right before we all started talking, that Mark Trusham and I wrote, where we proposed running an auction for vaccines, essentially, have companies bid for how much they would want to get when they pass certain development thresholds for a vaccine. And the reason for that was that we thought it would reveal the prices or the rewards the companies would demand, or if you will, the bare minimum reward they would demand for doing this important thing for people. And so I think a lot of work needs to focus on other ways of thinking about this, particularly if through that we can address some of what Sarah mentioned, which is access and affordability. Right now, high unit prices impede access. So we have a trade-off that Craig mentioned that isn't necessary at some level. You could have the same rewards to companies, it will lower price per unit, more units sold kind of argument, if we could get out of this problem where we use copays and block access in order to get price concessions or total spending reductions.
Thank you, Peter. Craig, and then Peter.
Yeah, I think that's an important thing as we think about how we pay for it. I guess I don't necessarily think, who should decide this, Bobby, I think is probably outside of an economist view. It's sort of more of a political question. But I think the way Peter was just talking about it is an important thing about it, is that we don't necessarily want to think about unit pricing for this, right? So you can think about licensing models, if you want to call it a Netflix model, if you want to call it a two-part tariff, it's like whatever you want to call it. The idea that we can get something that looks more like marginal cost or zero price. And perhaps more importantly, when it comes to how we think about insurance, really, it's hard to understand why we would want prohibitive cost sharing on a drug on the treatments for the coronavirus. It's unlikely to think we're going to have a lot of moral hazard here, that people are going to try and double up on the vaccine because it's free. Or people are going to try and sign up for taking remdesivir even if they're not sick because it's free. And so in that sense, getting to what looks like very effectively zero cost sharing is going to be important. I think it's really going to be most important for the vaccine. Right, we have to remember that the vaccine really, because we're going to try and count on herd immunity, and there are externalities if you choose not to get vaccinated, and we're giving it to healthy people. So the actual benefit when you take it is not as apparent as it is for an antiviral. We really want to focus on getting that to be zero price. And one could start to argue, if you want, that you could start thinking about, for lack of a better term, negative pricing. We really want to incentivize people to take that vaccine. People who might think that they're not otherwise at risk, the kind of people who are out without masks or things like that, that we want to get people, we really want to efficiently distribute that vaccine. Bob Jenna from Harvard had this nice column recently, or article, talking about the fact that we can't get people to get their kids vaccinated for the flu effectively. And that here we really need to do more to try and get this vaccine out there once we have it. And really that's going to be at a minimum a zero price.
Greg, thank you. Final word from Peter Newman. And while we're doing that, Maria, let's please do that last poll again. And Peter, take it away.
Yeah, so great discussion. Thanks again for inviting me. I had a lot of things to say, but I'll end on 3 quick points. One, I started out by saying I applaud ICER for their work. I think, really what it is the information is a public good, and government probably should be doing this, but they're not. So, ICER has stepped in and provided information to the marketplace on the value of products. We could have other voices, we could have other people doing it, but I think that's valuable. We need more of that. I would secondly say the societal perspective is important, and I would urge ICER and others to think about it. Doesn't mean the drug company gets the entire price that you show in the value, but it is important in sort of helping us understand the value, and to some extent to send the signals that may result. And finally, I come back to these insurance and access issues. And just to add to what was said, not only should we waive copays or maybe pay people to take their vaccines, we need to reform the insurance industry in fundamental ways, but we also need to figure out a way to make sure all Americans have insurance in the first place. And that would also help us as we face this pandemic and in general. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Sarah, Greg, Peter. Let's see our results of the panel, or of the poll, and looks very similar to what it was before. So this fireside chat was the beginning. I think we raised some important questions. I think we've all dodged the important one of how are we supposed to answer these questions. We're just mere economists, health services researchers. Somebody else has to make those decisions. So that is for another day, another webinar, and another opportunity to try to figure out how are we going to nail some of these to the ground. Thank you, guys. This exceeded my expectations. It was great fun. There was both heat, sparks, and warmth. So thank you, guys.
Bobby, I can
please, Peter, go ahead.
Yeah, I've seen questions come in the Q&A. I know we haven't addressed any of them. I mean, some of them have come up in natural conversation, but I just want to tell you, for the ones addressed to me, people, please feel free to email me. I'll answer those questions. I couldn't figure out a way to do it in the window while we were talking. So, but I'm happy to address the ones that were, most of them are of course attacking ICER, but the ones that are towards me, I'm happy to answer.
Yeah, same.
I appreciate that. Thank you, guys. Thank you all for attending. It's been great. Until the next time.